Okay, so let's get started. So my name is Mijang. I'm a new faculty member at the CS department here at Ohio State. Today is our great pleasure to have Fadel Adib from MIT, basically to kick off this exciting ALT seminar series as the first speaker of the series. The seminar is basically co-hosted by the CS department and the NSF AI Institute, AI Edge Institute. This talk will be video recorded, and the video will be available on the AI Edge Institute website. Before we get started, let me briefly give a brief introduction about the speaker. Fadel is currently an associate professor at MIT in Media Lab and as well as in the Department of ECS. He is the founding director of the Signal Kinetics Group, where he works on wireless and sensor technologies for networking, health monitoring, and robotics, and ocean IoT. His works really fit well with our seminar. Besides being a faculty member, he is also entrepreneur. He is the founder and CEO of a company basically commercializing his invention in the university. Fadel is a star in the area of IoT. He has so many awards. Let me just briefly pick up a few. He was named the Technology Review as one of the world's top 35 innovators. He is also awardee of the NASA Career Award, and he's also received the ACM SIG Mobile Doctoral Dissertation Award, and many others. They're so long I can't just summarize in a few sentences. Today he will give a talk titled "Decoding Hidden Words." Wireless and sensor technologies for ocean, health, and robotics. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Fadel.
Thank you so much, Mi, for your introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. Can you see my screen well?
Yes.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for being here. Very excited to be here with you today and share with you the research that my group and I have been working on. I'll be telling you about how we can decode hidden worlds using wireless and sensor technologies for oceans, health, and for robotics. Our research is motivated by our own human desire. As humans, we crave to explore hidden worlds. And this curiosity has driven us to pursue journeys to explore our environment, our seas, our oceans, and go even beyond our planet to explore outer space. We're also curious to explore the hidden world inside our own bodies, to learn about our own selves and about our health. And yet we know so little. Let us take the ocean. As of this year, more than 95% of the ocean has never been observed or explored. 95%. Even our human bodies, at any point in time, I know very little about what is going on inside my body. Am I getting sick? Am I recovering? Do I have COVID? I don't know. And it's quite difficult for me to get that information right away. And even when we try to build machines to allow them to explore the world and interact with it in new ways, much of the world remains hidden from them. For example, when we try to build our best robots, we want to make them see things just like us humans. But what if we could make them see things that are invisible to the human eye? These are the types of questions that drive my group and I to think about how we can develop technologies that would allow us to explore and decode hidden worlds in our oceans, in our bodies, and using our robots. And at the heart of all of this research are wireless and sensor mechanisms that allow us to perceive, sense, communicate, and decode. And today in this talk, I'm going to be sharing with you our research mission, which is to invent wireless and sensor technologies to decode hidden worlds. And I'll be telling you how we translate this mission into a reality in 3 areas, which are the oceans, the human body, and robotics. And after we invent our technologies and we publish our papers, we work with our collaborators in order to deploy them in order to address complex ecological, societal, and industrial problems. So for example, we work with oceanographers in order to deploy our underwater technologies and with medical doctors to translate our healthcare research. And sometimes we ourselves spin off startups from the lab to translate our technologies to real world impact, which is also something that I will be touching on today. So let me start by telling you about our research in the ocean. As I mentioned, more than 95% of the ocean has never been observed or explored. This means that we know less about the bottom of the ocean than we know about the far side of the moon and even of the surface of Mars. And so my team has been on a mission to take the Internet of Things in order to explore this underwater world. Now, you might be wondering why. First, there's enormous value in getting data from the ocean for combating climate change. The ocean is the single largest player in the world's global climate system. And if we can bring IoT underwater, then it would allow us to deploy sensors in the ocean, have them transmit data back to us so that we can measure temperature and underwater currents, monitor marine ecosystems, and use this data in climate models and in understanding the ocean's carbon cycle. Ocean sensors can also help us discover new species. Scientists estimate that 9 out of every 10 marine organisms have never been discovered. And an underwater IoT can be deployed to transmit back images and sounds of animals so we can discover new species and understand their migration patterns. An underwater IoT can also play a key role in food security. According to the United Nations, aquaculture is the world's fastest growing food sector. Aquaculture is seafood farming. And this is very important for the food security in the world because 1 in every 3 people rely on the ocean as their primary source of protein. So if you can build an ocean IoT, then you can deploy it in the ocean, use it to monitor aquaculture farms, and that can help protect them from environmental hazards or optimize feeding patterns and so on. And there's many other applications for an underwater IoT in underwater robotics, weather prediction, disaster response, defense, and so on. So we could enable all of these applications if we can build an underwater IoT, but we're not there yet. In fact, less than 1 in a million of the Internet of Things is underwater, even though the ocean covers more than 70% of our planet. So a few years ago, my team and I started thinking about how we could bring the Internet of Things underwater in order to enable all of the applications that I talked about. So how could we take a sensor, deploy it in the water, and have it transmit data and over extended periods of time and transmit this data back to us? And as we started doing that, we faced a problem. And the problem is that the battery life of underwater sensors is extremely limited. So as we look deeper into the problem, we realize that the reason for this is that underwater transmissions consume significant power, typically something of the order of few watts. And not only this, unlike, for example, my smartwatch or my smartphone where I can recharge it, which I can recharge every day, it's very difficult to recharge a sensor that is deployed in the ocean. I have to send a research vessel, pay $50,000 to $70,000 per day to replace its battery and come back. So this is why state-of-the-art sensors for tracking marine animals can only last for a few hours or maybe a couple of days, after which their batteries die. And it makes it very difficult to use them for long-term climate sensing or for discovering migration patterns of marine animals. And it got us thinking about how we could reduce the power consumption of underwater communication so we can enable these applications. So today I want to tell you about how we overcame this problem by developing a technology that enables underwater backscatter networking. This kind of communication technology consumes net zero power, which enables our sensor to operate over very long periods of time without requiring any batteries. So let me describe to you how our technology works at a high level, why we say it is net zero power, by comparing it to how traditional sensor communications work in underwater environments. So in these environments, you typically have, for example, a drone or a submarine or a ship, or even an access point that is near the shore that wants to communicate with many sensors. And for simplicity, let's just focus on one temperature sensor that wants to send data. For those of you who are not familiar, you cannot use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth underwater because they rely on radio frequency signals, which do not work in water. To send information to the drone, today's sensors use acoustic signals. So the sensor has a speaker, and for example, the underwater drone has a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, and the sensor transmits data using sound waves. The problem with this approach is that generating sound or acoustic signals requires a lot of energy, which drains the sensor's battery. In contrast, in our technology, the sensor does not need to generate any acoustic signal to communicate. Let me tell you how it works. In our design, the speaker and the hydrophone are both at the drone. And the sensor is connected to an acoustic reflector, which you can think of as a mirror for simplicity. So when the transmitter sends sound, it reaches the sensor and then it reflects back to the hydrophone receiver. Now, in order to communicate information, all the sensor needs to do is to toggle its reflector between reflective and non-reflective states. And once it can toggle between two states, it can transmit bits of zeros and ones, and that allows it to communicate its sensor data, any message that it wants in binary. So to summarize, in traditional communications, a sensor must generate its own acoustic signal, which requires a lot of energy and is power consuming and drains its battery. But in our technology, it only needs to turn a switch on and off. And since the drone usually has its own power source, this allows us to shift all the energy requirement from all the sensors to a centralized place at the drone and make all of the sensors battery free. Now, of course, all of this is great, but there's still one question, which is how can we control the reflections of acoustic signals? Our idea was to use piezoelectricity to design programmable acoustic reflectors. For those of you who are not familiar, the piezoelectric effect refers to the ability of certain materials to transform mechanical energy into electrical energy. And let me explain this using a simplified example. Let us say that we have a piezoelectric material and we try to measure the electric voltage across it. If you have a speaker and the speaker transmits an acoustic signal or sound, the signal travels as a pressure wave and it causes the piezoelectric material to vibrate. And this vibration creates an electrical signal at the terminals of the piezoelectric material. So effectively, the material transforms mechanical energy, which is sound, into electrical energy, which is the voltage. But remember, what I want to do is to transform this material into a reflector. And so to do this, all we did is we added a switch. When the switch is open, the material behaves freely and it transforms the acoustic signal into an electrical signal. So let us see what happens when the switch is closed. When the switch is closed, the two terminals of the material are connected to each other. And when the terminals are connected, you cannot have any voltage, and so the device cannot vibrate. So if you transmit an acoustic signal, where does its energy go? It has to be reflected back. And so by closing the switch, we can transform the piezoelectric material into a reflector. And now to communicate, all we need to do is to turn the switch on and off between the reflective and non-reflective states, which can be done using a simple transistor. And this is what allows our sensor to communicate without generating the power-consuming sound signal. Now, this is a simplified description of how our technology works. In practice, what we actually need to do is to modulate the reflection coefficient, gamma, which is given by the impedance equation that you can see here in the bottom right. And in the interest of time, I will not go into this in details, but in our papers, we describe how we can carefully manipulate the impedances in order to optimize performance. And we call this technology piezoacoustic backscatter because it uses the piezoelectric effect in order for it to communicate by reflection or backscatter. And one of the most important things about this technology is that our sensor needs 1 million times less power, something of the order of a few microwatts, to communicate rather than what standard underwater modems can require, which is typically something of the order of a few watts. And not only this, our sensor can also harvest energy in the non-reflective or absorptive states, which allows it to make the whole thing battery free. So it harvests energy in the absorptive state and it uses it to control the switch that allows it to communicate. So let me show you our technology in action from one of our first experimental results in a large pool. So I'm going to show you a short clip that was shot in a large pool here on MIT's campus. At the far end of the pool, you can see the hydrophone receiver and our projector, which is a speaker. And here's our sensor, which is connected to a circuit that has an LED. Now, remember that this sensor has no battery. But as I play the video, you can see the LED lights up. And the reason it lights up is because it is able to harvest enough acoustic signals in order to power up the onboard processor and also power up the LED. So this shows that how we can power the sensor remotely. And next, I want to show you how we can decode the sensor's response using this hydrophone that was at the far end of the pool. So we measured the backscatter signal at the hydrophone, and I'm going to plot the normalized amplitude as a function of time over here. And this is the signal that we get. At about 2.5 seconds, the speaker starts transmitting, and so you see a jump in a signal. And at about 3 seconds, you start seeing the change between two different levels. And the reason you see this change between these two levels is because our nose starts backscattering, so reflecting or absorbing the signals. And because the hydrophone can sense these amplitude changes, it can use them in order to decode the backscatter pattern. Now, if you're wondering how come the signal does not go entirely to zero when our sensor is absorbing energy, remember that you don't just get the reflection from the sensor, but you also get the direct signal from the speaker, as well as other reflections in the environment. And building on this basic idea, we developed different algorithms and techniques to scale to many nodes and deal with other reflections in the environment. So here you can see one of our prototypes. You can see this transducer, the piezoelectric transducer that we fabricated and 3D printed. One of the questions that I often get is, how do you know in which direction you need to reflect the signal back or not reflect it back? And the thing to realize here is that while I describe this as a mirror, the mirror is really an analogy. And actually, you can build your transducer such that it's omnidirectional and independent of where the signal comes from, you're able to reflect it back. We also built our electronics that you can see here for energy harvesting, bidirectional communications, both downlink and uplink, and also for interfacing with different types of sensors. And this whole thing costs about $100, which by oceanographic standards, if any of you are familiar with oceanographic equipment, is actually very cheap because it usually costs something of the order of tens of thousands of dollars. And it consumes extremely low power because it uses backscatter. And building on this technology over the past few years, we've been advancing it in different ways. So for example, in terms of fabrication, we've been working on acoustic metamaterials to enable ultra-wideband underwater operation. We've also been developing communication capabilities by incorporating mechanisms such as MIMO, full duplex, and multiple access. We've also demonstrated how you can use this technology for localization. Similar to how Wi-Fi and Bluetooth don't work underwater, GPS signals also don't work underwater. And so we've shown how you can use these, our batteryless sensors to enable accurate underwater localization. We've also been recently using them for incorporating low power machine learning models in them for bioacoustics applications. And most recently, we've also shown that you can use the sensor that we built in order to take images underwater for new climate and ecological monitoring applications. Now, in the interest of time, I will not be able to go into each of these, but I wanted to show you a couple of the systems that we built using this basic technology. So one of the exciting things that we wanted to see is, can you enable battery-free underwater imaging? And we've shown that you can power up sensors, we've shown that you can communicate, but imaging is a whole different ballgame because it's a much more complex task to do, especially in an underwater environment. Over here, I'm gonna show you a video. To the right, you can see our underwater measurement setup, which is entirely batteryless. Here, the arrow points to our imaging sensor, our multicolor active illumination, and our underwater objects. To the C, you can see the image that is received. As I play the video, you can see that the image is being reconstructed. And here I want to note three things. First, we use active illumination in order to deal with dark underwater environments. So especially in the deep sea where you don't have light. Second, the lowest power CMOS imaging sensors that are on the market are monochromatic. So we developed a mechanism for multicolor LED illumination in order to enable reconstruction of color images. And third, the image is reconstructed in chunks because of the limitations on both the memory constraints of the ultra-low power processors and because of the bandwidth limitations of the underwater communication channel. I want to also show you some of the sample images that we received. So over here, you can see an image of an underwater, of a starfish, and you can see how we're able to recover it and all of its features. This is an image of that my students captured in the wild. So in a lake in New Hampshire, they went there, they deployed the camera, and they were able to image underwater pollution. And this here is an image of a plant that is growing. So what we did is we got an underwater plant, a seed, we planted it in a setup, and we were able to monitor its growth over multiple days. So you can see that the plant is growing over time. And this is a pretty remarkable result, because today, if you were to try to deploy an underwater camera, you would be so worried about it running out of battery or running out of energy. But because our whole sensor is batteryless, you can just use it and monitor things over an extended period of time. And so another project beyond imaging that I want to tell you about is some of our recent work on underwater batteryless AI. So again, building on this basic idea that you could sense, compute, and image underwater, we started thinking, can we bring some recent advances in TinyML to underwater inference applications and underwater machine learning applications? And this is a project that was in collaboration with Imperial College London. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to deploy an underwater speaker or a hydrophone and use it to recognize different sounds of marine animals. And the reason why we wanted to do that is we wanted to be able to use this in the future, for example, to understand migration patterns or to discover sounds of animals or sounds of new species. And in some of our early results, we showed that we're able to achieve over 85% accuracy in identifying these species by deploying sort of these trimmed down TinyML models. And this is pretty exciting because now you can go beyond sensing to doing edge inference and also edge machine learning so that we could do inference in the edge in these extreme underwater environments. And while we've done progress on sort of different areas in building this technology, there is also still so much to be done. This is really only the beginning. So we've shown that you can bring down the power consumption of underwater communication from few watts to few microwatts. In my group, we also build ICs, something that I'll talk about in a little bit. And some of our early simulations show that you could also, if you were to build our sensor into an IC, then you can bring it down to nanowatt power levels. And if you can bring it down to nanowatt power levels, then we can start, even if we were to add a battery and use backscatter for communication, then it could last for multiple decades and you would stop worrying about even being able to harvest enough energy to power them up. When we started this project, we started first in a very small pool, a really few tens of centimeters. We pushed it to a few meters. Now we're operating at the order of tens of meters or maybe close to 100 meters. And we've been collaborating with oceanographers at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to be able to push it to kilometer scale distances so that we can start either having these in offshore deployments or deeper into the ocean. Building on localization, you can imagine building, developing these new robots that use these batteryless sensors for underwater navigation. And there's so many other applications. I think you lost my screen, right?
Yeah.
Just 1 second. And we were here. And there's so many other applications that we could use this for discovering marine species, for aquaculture, climate change modeling, defense, and so on. One of the exciting and challenging things about these technologies is that you have to actually take them to the ocean or take them to the river and testing them there. Here you can see we've run thousands of experimental trials. You can see two of my students, Osvi and Jose, who are we're deploying some of these batteryless nodes for temperature and pressure sensing in the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the exciting applications of this technology extends even beyond the planet. Scientists recently discovered subsurface oceans, for example, in Saturn's moon Titan. And you can imagine over there, energy is even scarcer. So being able to use ultra low power communication technologies and inserting them there, it can help us in search for life in future space missions to search for and sample water in distant planets. Because of the different applications and the capabilities, this technology was named as an Ocean Shot for the Decade last year by the U.S. National Academy's Committee on Ocean Sciences. And we've also released the code, the tutorials, and the schematic for people to be able to build these step by step, because it really brings together concepts from mechanical engineering, from oceanography, from EE, CS, machine learning. And so if any of you are interested, please feel free to check out these tutorials. And we always get questions on people who are reproducing this, and we'd be happy to answer them as well. And so with this, I've told you our research on decoding the hidden underwater world. In the remainder of the talk, I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in sensing the human body, and also touch on some of the research that we've been recently doing in robotics and automation. So, well, today there's a lot of interest in wearables, and this interest has been going on for a couple of decades. In our research, we've been thinking about how we could either sense the human body without any sensor on the body, so using wireless signals and wireless reflections in the environment, as well as how we can sense the human body not using wearables, but using ingestibles or implantables, IoT that we can build inside the human body. And I want to briefly tell you about what we've been doing in each of these areas, starting with some of the research that we've been doing in contactless sensing. Now, this is work that we've been doing for about maybe almost a decade now. I want to show you one of the earliest prototypes that we built. So I'm going to show you a video. Here, this is the device that we built. In this video, we put the device in another room behind the wall. And in the bottom left, you see the output screen of the device. You see the red dot on the screen tells you where the device thinks the person is at every point in time. Now, the way this technology works is this device that is on the other side of the wall, it sends a wireless signal that goes through the wall, reflects off the person's body, and comes back. And it analyzes these reflections without any sensor on the person's body in order to track them accurately. So you can see how accurately the red dot tracks the person. And one thing that I will note here is that the spiral on the ground is only there to show you the level of accuracy that we're able to get in tracking the person. And because we're tracking using reflections, not only you can track people's locations, you can also track, for example, their different hands, gestures, and movements. So for example, over here, the person points at the TV to turn it off. And of course, because the device works through walls, let's say this person leaves the room and forget to turn off the light, all they need to do is to point in the direction of that room. And we do all of this using a device that is on the other side of the wall in the adjacent room. And so building on this basic capability over the years, we've shown how you can enable wireless sensing, so how you can contactly sense people's locations, gestures, breathing, heart rate. Our research, this was actually my PhD thesis. It led to a startup whose technologies are now used to monitor thousands of patients with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even COVID-19. It was used to monitor elderly having COVID-19 and recovering during the pandemic. And it's also had a commercial impact. We started originally with Wi-Fi. This is going to be part of the next Wi-Fi standard. It's being core to 6G, and it influenced products that are already on the market. And because of this, a few years ago, we were invited to the White House, and we demoed this to President Obama. As a faculty, my team has been also pushing this technology to enable more capabilities. So we showed that you can extract people's heart rate, but one of the questions that I had was, can you extract entire heart recordings, similar to how we get, for example, ECG signals? And we've been thinking how you could do that to capture finer-grained information. And to do this, we developed a 4D cardiac beamformer, which can both track things in 3D space as well as over time. And the basic idea is similar to before, which is that you're able to focus on the person's heart, search for it in 3D, and once you be informed on where the reflections is coming from, you're able to filter them and extract microcardiac events. So again, I'm not going to go into the details of these equations. We go into them in details in the paper, but what I want to give is an intuition, because that is really the fundamental thing that enables all of these technologies. And the way it works is that you have a device that sends a wireless signal, captures the reflections of the person's body. And as the heart contracts and relaxes, you're able to capture microcardiac vibration. And so we've shown that you can extract, for example, the aortic valve opening and closing, the mitral valve opening and closing, and the isovolumetric contraction, all using the wireless signals and the tiny vibrations that are coming off of the person's chest. Now, one of the things that we noticed as we were building this technology is that these wireless reflections that you're getting have very minute vibrations. And even after filtering, so for example, this was one of the signals that we were able to get. You could see that in each heartbeat, you have sort of in each beat, there's the two main beats. And we compared the two, we put a sensor on the person's body, and we compared what we were getting wirelessly from what we were getting using an accelerometer on the body to see if they map to each other. So we put an on-body accelerometer, and we tried to compare it to a contactless sensor that was measuring the reflections. And when we did that, we saw that the two waveforms looked actually quite similar. You can see that the beats sort of match in time and so on and so forth. But when we tried to correlate them to each other, the correlation was relatively low. It was something of the order of 0.6. And this did not make much sense to us as to why was the correlation low when they looked so similar. But then we realized that the reason for this is that these are inherently different modalities. The accelerometer is taking some derivative of the displacement, while we're actually directly measuring the vibrations, the distance using wireless signals. But this is also one of the classical problems that sort of machine learning or deep learning models can solve. And so we developed, by training on pairs of data pairs, we developed a data-driven model that can translate the wireless reflections that we are getting to what you would otherwise get from an on-body accelerometer. And that is used to discover what is called the seismocardiogram, which refers to the vibrations of the heart as measured mechanically. And we extended the model to be able to time different microcardiac events using customized architectures. And we evaluated it in different environments for over more than 100,000 heartbeats, different subjects. So for example, we put our sensor near someone's desk, near their bed, while they were reading. And we developed these mechanisms that can also remove motion artifacts in the environment, eliminate other people who are moving around. And we showed that you're able to extract each of these 5 microcardiac events with fairly high accuracy. So a couple of years ago, we showed that you could extract them with about 98 to 99% accuracy. Then we started getting even more greedy. Now that we could get people's heart rates, we started thinking, can you discover people's emotions or stress levels? Because these were also encoded in people's vital signs. And recently, we also showed that you could develop mechanisms by building on this area of research that is called affective computing to extract people's stress levels. And looking forward, again, so much has been demonstrated in this field of wireless sensing, but so much is still open for exploration. So we've been collaborating with medical doctors on being able to diagnose and monitor cardiovascular diseases. So now that we can extract cardiac recordings, can you use these to continuously monitor or detect arrhythmias or ischemia or different types of cardiovascular diseases? We've been also thinking about how you can develop richer and more robust recordings to extract even more microcardiac events. So we showed that you can extract 5 microcardiac events but actually in seismocardiograms, usually you can extract up to 9. So how can we further refine the filter so that we can extract even finer grained information? And given that most recently we were able to detect stress level, we've also been thinking about how you can extend that for mental health monitoring and improving mental health interventions, or even improving our productivity. Maybe I put a sensor here, it detects when I'm stressed, and it tells me, look, even if what you want is to be more productive, it's probably better to go now for a walk and come back. And so there's so many more opportunities that are still open, and there's a lot still to be able to extract from wireless reflections and from wireless sensing. And I also told you that beyond sensing the human body from the outside, we've also been working on sensing the human body on the inside using microimplants. So a few years ago, a person got an implant right under their skin live at the World Mobile Show. Some of you might be familiar that implant was simply an RFID. And the only thing that the person wanted to use the RFID for was access control, so to identify themselves. In a recent op-ed article, someone wrote, who received the microimplant wrote, "My implant is both less scary and less useful than you might think." And of course, while implants under the skin are not very useful, if you can take them and put them inside the human body, they have enormous applications in digital medicine. So one of the other things that we've been working on is that taking microimplants like this one, which have no batteries, and being able to put them inside the human body so that we could use them for a long-term monitoring. So how can you power up and communicate with these implants when they have no batteries? Again, we use wireless power using a device that is outside the body, sends a signal, which goes through the body, powers the microimplant up, and then it sends data so that you can monitor the body from the inside. And the reason we wanted to do this is that it has so many applications. So for example, one of the main applications is a continuous sensing of biomarkers and tumors inside the body. You can imagine a network of sensors, sensing conditions, sending data to the outside world. For example, they could automatically sense someone's gut microbiome or stomach condition. In the future, you can imagine using them to also predict diseases. Like I could take a microimplant, and if I'm traveling and I get exposed to COVID, it would automatically tell me to self-isolate so that I don't keep spreading it to other people. Some of the other applications are in long-term drug delivery systems. Today, when you take a microimplant, when you take a pill, you envision that it immediately releases the drug inside the body. But there's many applications that need continuous and long-term drug delivery. So using these batteryless microimplants, you can imagine swallowing a pill that expands inside the body. And then if every once in a while, you send it a command that triggered a drug release. And this has also many applications, for example, in medical adherence for people who might have Alzheimer's and might forget to take their medications. And so there's many other applications for wireless and batteryless microimplants inside the body. And to enable these applications, we've been developing technologies that can remotely power and communicate with deep tissue, batteryless, and intelligent microimplants. Now, this also is a very difficult challenge, and it's a broad vision. When we started trying to build these microimplants, one of the main challenges that we face is that the human body attenuates wireless signals significantly. So if you try to transmit a wireless signal from outside the body, it will transmit about 1,000 to 10,000 times faster inside the body than in the air. And on top of that, the tissues that are surrounding it impact its harvesting efficiency and the signal that you're able to transmit back. And this is why today's implants can only be implanted right under the skin, and you cannot power them up in deep tissues. And so we've been thinking about how we can power and communicate with sensors in deep tissues, despite the tissue complexity and the attenuation. And to overcome these, we've been developing different types of mechanisms. One thing that we've been working on is ways of beaming the signal inside the human body without blasting a lot of energy, in ways that, irrespective of where the sensor is inside the body, you're able to deliver power at safe levels and still be able to power them up despite the attenuation and the tissue complexity. And the second area that we've been working on is building microchips inside the human body that can reconfigure themselves and adapt to different tissues. Now, in the interest of time, I will not be able to go into both of them, but I want to share with you some of the interesting challenges that you come across as you start building these microchips that operate inside the human body, which is a much more complex environment than, for example, these IoT devices that we usually build to work in smart indoor environments. One of the challenges that we built is that after we started developing this mechanism to power up microimplants inside deep tissues, we would take the microimplant, we would put it at a slightly different location inside the human body at the same depth and at the same distance, and we would not be able to power it or communicate with it. So you're taking the same microimplant and supposedly it's facing the same attenuation, and yet we were not able to power it up and communicate with it. And as we started digging deeper into this problem, we realized that one of the problems is that the antenna performance drastically changes inside the body. So if you take an implant and you put it, for example, inside a muscle, you transmit a 900 megahertz signal in the ISM band, you usually need a minimum amount of signal to be able to power it up. So you take the microimplant, you put it inside the muscle, there's some minimum turn on threshold, you're able to get enough power to power it up. But you take the same implant, you put it at the same depth inside fat tissue, and you're not able to power it up because you get much less signal even though you're at the same distance. And to try to understand what was going on, we tried to transmit signals at different frequencies. And what we realized is that the tissue itself impacts the maximum power and where you would get it. So for example, in muscle, the highest power that you get is at 900 megahertz. But when you take this microimplant and you put it in fat, the maximum power that you would get is at 1.1 gigahertz. But this is pretty challenging because you can't just transmit at different powers. It's not even allowed by FCC regulations to transmit at all of these frequencies. And as the microimplant moves inside the human body, it's going to be surrounded by different tissues. And so to overcome this challenge, we developed mechanisms that allow microimplants to reprogram themselves, and they can reprogram themselves, including the resonance, so that they can adapt to different embodied tissues. So I just want to give you the intuition of how our system and our reprogramming work. The way it works is that implants inside the tissues are usually designed as loop antennas that resonate with the harvesting chip. And the resonance is given by an equation that models it, which you can see here. And because of this resonance, you get a peak at around, let's say, 1.1 gigahertz. So what we did is that we added a coupled structure to control the resonance. So for those of you who have some background in electromagnetics, you know that coupling is usually a bad idea. But we use this idea for our benefit. So we added another loop, and we by adding this loop, it changes the properties of the resonance. But then we took this a step further, and we started controlling this resonance using an on-chip capacitance. And by controlling this resonance, we were able to shift it all the way down back to, say, 900 megahertz. And so this coupled structure, by reprogramming the sensor after it is swallowed or after it is injected into the body, we're able to adapt to different tissues. And of course, here I talked about the resonance adaptation, but we take adaptation all the way. We adapt the resonance, the energy harvesting, the communication, the MAC protocol, and even the end-to-end bitrate adaptation. So over here, you can see one of the sensors that we built. You can see it's the microchip. We built it on a programmable substrate. And so it can be rolled, for example, into a pill form, or because it's flexible, it could be laminated on an organ. And our chip has all of the different capabilities that I talked about. So it has a transmitter, a receiver, power management, programmable antenna tuning, and so on. And we, in collaboration with doctors at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, we've run hundreds of experimental trials in different tissues, as well as in animals. So we put it, for example, inside a pig, and we've shown that you can adapt the resonance over hundreds of megahertz. You can achieve throughputs that are up to 6 megahertz. You can reduce the power consumption to a few nanowatts, and you can operate at different depths. And one of the most important things that we were able to achieve is, if you remember, I started by saying that you can only, today, the sensors can only be powered up at superficial depth if you're trying to power them up from a distance outside the body. And through our collaborations, we showed that you can power up our sensors deep inside tissues, inside living animals. And so this really paves the way for so many of the applications that we would want to enable. For example, whether it's localization or stimulation or drug dosing and so on. One of the other things that this opens up, both as a concern as an opportunity, is the security of the data that you're transmitting outside the body. Now that you're transmitting data from inside the body, this is very sort of critical information. And so in some of our recent work, we've also shown that you can encrypt this data that you're transmitting and you can authenticate it. And again, the ability to be able to sense inside the body at very low power level opens both new opportunities and challenges. How do you summarize this data through some inference? How do you allow this adaptation, adding some intelligence to this edge adaptation inside the human body? And how can you build this to enable both new applications and to deliver new therapeutic and diagnostic capabilities? And so with this, I've told you about our research inside the human body and with oceans. I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you about our research in the context of robotics and automation. And when we started working on robotics, we were inspired by the amazing research that people in robotics and computer vision have enabled, where they've showed that you could allow robots to almost grasp or retrieve things and perceive the environments almost as good as us humans. And coming from sort of a wireless perspective, we started thinking, can we enable robots to perceive things that are invisible to the human eye? For example, can you give them boxes and they can know what is inside closed boxes, or know whether the food or medicine inside the bottle is safe? Or can you allow a robot to fetch or retrieve items that it could not otherwise see using computer vision or using cameras? And the way we answer these questions affirmatively is by augmenting robots with wireless perception. Similar to how wireless and radio frequency signals can go through occlusions like walls, they can also go through occlusions which are piles. And so we've used these capabilities in order to extend robotic perception beyond line of sight. So for example, if a robot in this environment here wants to retrieve a target item that is under clutter, and it has a camera that is on its wrist, the camera cannot see the item that is of interest. So the item is occluded. And so by augmenting the robot with wireless vision, we showed how you can allow it to know where the item is, navigate towards it, even though it does not see it. It knows where it is, so it removes what is on top of it, and it is able to pick it up and retrieve the item of interest. And so the way we did that is by adding to vision-based perception, RF perception. So over here, for example, you can see that there's antennas that are on the table. The item of interest is tagged with an RFID, and we built this very accurate localization mechanism that can localize the RFID with high precision inside the closed box. So you can see in the bottom left that you're able to localize the item, and we've shown that you can achieve centimeter scale 3D localization. And with this accurate localization, now even though the robot cannot see the item, it knows where it is, and it is able to start navigating towards it. So we started building these models that fuse computer vision, these advanced computer vision models, with RF perception to allow the robot to move around, navigate around obstacles, know where the item is, even though it does not see it. Go ahead, because it knows where it is, it removes what is on top of it, moves it to the side, and then it goes back and it is able to retrieve the item of interest. So for example, over here, it is this green block that it is able to pick up. And you can optimize these. We've shown that you can enable sort of end-to-end optimization by optimizing the control effort and the uncertainty using both vision and RF perception. And we built on this. So far, I showed you how the antennas were on the table. We then fully integrated the antennas onto the robot. So we mounted the antennas on the gripper. Over here in this example, the robot wants to retrieve a hidden key that is inside a pile. So there's a key that is under the pile. There's a camera that is in the robot's hand. Again, the camera cannot see the key. And so if you look from its field of view, the key is not visible. And so it uses RF perception in order to locate the keys. Once it locates them, it optimizes what it needs to remove, and it is able to pick up the item of interest. We've also shown that you could take this in different environments. So for example, over here, it's trying to search for a remote control that is under this pile of clothing items. It moves them to the side. And then once it moves them to the side, you can see the RFID tagged remote control. It is able to pick it up, and then it can hand it over to my student so that she can watch her favorite TV show, although hopefully not in the lab. And the way we did this is by developing these RF visual reinforcement learning networks that can achieve extremely high success rates that outperform both what RF alone can achieve and what vision can achieve in very complex environments. And recently, we also showed how you can extend this for non-RFID tagged items. And this is a pretty also exciting result, because for about 2 decades, the mobile sensing and mobile networking communities use RF localization to localize RF tagged items. But what we recently showed is by doing RF visual fusion, the mere presence of an RFID tagged item allows you to localize almost everything else with much higher accuracy and extend the ability to efficiently retrieve beyond RF tagging. And this work was recently named by a Wall Street Journal as one of the AI trends to watch. And one of the reasons is I think it opens up so many applications. So in the future, you can imagine using it in automated grocery fulfillment or in coordination in factories or in fulfillment in warehouses. And excited by the capabilities, recently with one of my former students, I co-founded a company, Cartesian Fit Systems, and we're working on commercializing our research specifically in the context of retail automation for localization, but also in the future, trying to push it up the supply chain towards robotics and logistics. And with this, in this talk, I've told you about our mission of inventing wireless and sensor technologies to decode hidden worlds in the oceans, inside the human body, for robotics. Over here, you can see my team. We love building things, so you can see each of us holding some of one of the sensors that we built or that we work with. And we work together to invent these technologies, and also with our collaborators around the world to develop them and translate them to real-world impact. With this, I'll wrap up my talk. If you're interested in diving more into our papers, videos, or even social media, you can also scan the QR code here in the top right, and it will lead you to our different papers and the videos that describe in more details our technologies. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Fadel. Very nice talk. We have quite a few questions. Maybe we start with Anish.
Oh, yeah, Fadel, what a lovely talk. Thank you for sharing this with us. Really enjoyed it. And for me personally, because we've built low power radars and tried to do through wall stuff in different kind of sensing, I could really relate to each of your innovations. So very, very cool. The question I wanted to ask you was, in so many of these inference contexts that you were describing, there is a lot of variability in the clutter in the background. And sometimes, even like you were talking about stress, there's sort of individual foreground level variability. So in order to personalize or to transfer the solutions to these different contexts, what are you finding about how much data you need? There was one example you gave about deep learning. So So are you finding that it is plausible to generate the variability across the foreground and background contexts with sufficient data? Or are there techniques by which you can really reduce the amount of data that you need to validate that this works in practice?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, great questions. So in terms of RF, for example, there's always, we try to actually take signal processing as much as we can and then use machine learning for whatever the remaining inference that we might not be able to model that is nonlinear. So for example, one of the ways that we ended up using to deal with clutter initially is larger bandwidth so that you can estimate time of flight using chirp-based signals. And once you get time of flight measurements, then you can isolate what is the primary reflection, what is the secondary reflection. Once you add on top of this the phase arrays, then that also allows you to zoom in on people and isolate them in the environment. Once you're able to isolate people, then it becomes easier, much easier to deal with the other clutter that is coming back. To what extent all of these are generalizable? How much data is needed? I think the amount of data that is needed depends on to what level we end up, like we develop our hardware. And so it's really sort of, as you were alluding to, it really depends. With more signal processing from first principles, probably the less data that you're gonna use. One of the projects that I didn't talk about where we sort of also did the combination was in food sensing, where we were trying to detect, for example, food adulteration. And over there, the content of the type of adulterant matters, the content of the environmental multipath also matters. The material of the bottle matters. And so we started developing these conditional models, doing variational autoencoders, where we have some stuff that is data-driven, but also complement it to we start with simulation to get us up until a certain level, and then we fine-tune it by using some other layers that allow us to adapt to different environments. One of the challenges almost always with these generative models is that there's always attacks that you could use things to fool them. But it's also the same thing in computer vision. And yet, despite that, in computer vision, they've been, sometimes you could still give it something that for us is definitely a human and it could somehow identify as a cat. Now, over time, people start figuring out what these adversarial attacks are and overcoming them. And so what is going to end up being more robust? It ends up being a process. Practically, the stuff that we've done is being deployed already. So locations, even with multiple people, you can get it extremely accurately. To be honest, even breathing and heart rate, you can get them extremely accurately because you're really getting them from first principles. Things like emotions or stress, these become much more difficult because now, as you mentioned, you start having the human variability as well. The good thing is that there's this whole field of affective computing that has tried to sort of weed out or home in on how do you run these tests? How do you make them as much objective as possible? But with or without the availability, even if it's still a little bit subjective, you could still infer a lot of information that could be valuable, whether it's commercially valuable or valuable from a health perspective. And the way there's two ways of thinking about any research problem. A is you keep refining it more and more, and sort of this is what we want to do in the lab and trying to understand the limits and the theoretical capabilities and how do we push it in different ways. But when we're taking them into the real world, we're thinking what type of performance is sufficient to build an MVP and to give us ROI. And one of the things that I've realized is that most of the time we end up pushing our technologies further than what is necessary to get really good commercial value. But then that comes in version 2 or version 3 of the products that we're building and bringing to the real world.
Oh, great points. Yeah, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Anish. I do see there's a question on the chat box from Sestri. So basically, I think the question is related to the first part of the talk. I believe it's related to the backscatter technology. I think the question is, does this mean the sensor can perform measurements only when it received the backscattered energy and not before and after?
Yeah, this is a great question. Initially, when we first built the first prototype, the answer was yes. But actually, over time, there's a couple of things that end up happening. A, you can harvest energy and store it in your capacitor, or like whatever rechargeable battery, and then you can even if the transmitter is not transmitting high power, there's almost always sound in underwater. So you can do ambient backscatter of that sound and have a receiver that can decode that. The other way that you could think of it is you can harvest the energy, do backscatter when you want, do sensing, use that energy for sensing, and then when you have a drone that comes by, you can then backscatter the data to it. Or you could think about hybrid backscatter. All of these are like where sometimes you backscatter and sometimes you decide to transmit. And one of the really nice things is all of these, in the context of underwater, there's still open problems. It ends up being like there's very nice analogies for RF, but also there are all of these new constraints that arise in underwater environments, and they make the problems intellectually very interesting. And at the same time, there's all of these new applications that drive sort of different constraints, whether it's on the computation, whether it's on the energy, and so on and so forth. So the answer is, initially it was the case, not the case anymore. What would be the optimal thing? It's such a blue sky field and so many capabilities that like you can imagine, and so many applications, and each of them will determine what is going to be the best way to build these systems.
Great. Thanks so much. Any question from the audience? Anybody? Actually, I have a question. I think we're waiting for other people's questions. So the first question is also related to the underwater backscatter. What is the sensing range? Basically, how close the underwater robot has to be close to the sensor, right, to get the sensor readings?
So when we started, it was tens of centimeters. Then it became about 4 meters. Then it became 10 meters. Then it became 16 meters. Some of the stuff that were unpublished now, it's like some of our recent tests are showing something of the order of 100 meters, maybe, or so. Our simulations show that you should be able to get it to, if you were to optimize, like use more optimal transducer, you should be able to get it to kilometer levels. And there's been some recent work also in the acoustics community that has, where people have put in like different types of nodes and different types of piezoelectric materials, and they verified that that type of level should be achievable. I think there's a lot of also theoretical work that will still be doable. We are hoping to release some tool that would allow people to understand like how different parameters are going to impact the range. In our upcoming Nature Communications paper, we analyze sort of the downlink range. We don't analyze the uplink range as well. So that is something that we're currently working on. One of the challenges is we love to develop theoretical things and also verify them experimentally. And it ends up being a bit of a challenge to verify some of these experimentally, especially that in some ways we're still new to the acoustics field.
Yeah, I think that's also echoes with what you just mentioned, that whether we are good enough for real world applications, right? For example, if it's 10 meters is good enough for this technology to be deployed in real world settings, we don't necessarily go beyond that. Something like that. Okay, so there are a few other questions on the chat box, and I think one from in one of the papers of yours, you have addressed the flash effect reflection from the inanimate objects behind the wall? Is there any other of such things in underwater reflection? I think we read your papers in the class, and this is kind of like a question in context of underwater scenarios.
Yeah. The answer is yes. I mean, one of the main things is you have also self-interference jamming. Both you have the direct from the transmitter, but you also have the reflections from the seabed and the both the floor and the surface. And in our U2B paper, SIGCOMM 2020, we talk about it a little bit. Some of the stuff that we're also working on now is trying to address that as well to, again, extend the range and be able to sense over further distances.
Cool. I think another question from the audience is for the, I think people are really interested in your underwater IoT project. Is there any other kind of power backup plan for this? I think my interpretation for this question is, because it is a batteryless system, do we have a backup plan in case, anything bad happens?
You could always add a small battery, and backscatter would still be immensely helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, backscatter reduces the energy consumption by 5 or 6 orders of magnitude. And then on top of that, you can operate it entirely based on the harvested energy. If there's no harvested energy, you could still use or if you're not harvesting enough energy, you could still have an onboard battery, and you could do that. There's also other ways of harvesting energy potentially in the ocean. Like you could try, if you're near the surface, you can try to use sunlight. If you're also near the surface, then you can use wave energy. If you're deeper, you can use temperature gradients, or you could use underwater currents. There are a lot of renewable energy sources in the ocean if you want to try to use, or even in rivers, if you want to use other mechanisms for it. And you could still use backscatter because it's a more optimal way to communicate. It's a lower power, a more efficient way to communicate.
Cool. Any questions from the audience? I think I have the last question. So we are actually towards the Liuji 6G area, right? So what's your thoughts on the role of 6G that potentially can power some of the applications you mentioned today?
My understanding is actually 6G is going to be it's going to have joint sensing and communication. So a lot of the original sensing stuff is going to be in 6G. Also, even with 5G, like the millimeter waves, you could also use them for a lot of sensing applications. I think a lot of the health, the question is, what are the new applications that it's going to drive? Probably health, industrial IoT, and mining the signals for different type of information. Probably going to be, it's going to be an exciting time for both using existing technologies as opposed to originally when we started, we had to build our own devices because like the devices that already existed could not give us the channel state information that we needed. So in the original see-through wall with Wi-Fi paper, we had to build USRPs. People later on started using these cards these cards that have give CSI information. Now Wi-Fi itself, you can probably get 80 or even 160 megahertz of bandwidth. That's pretty amazing. If you combine that with the spatial, the multiple antennas, you can start doing very nice wireless sensing on existing Wi-Fi as well. And like 6G, we'll see what's going to happen with 6G. I think it's still at the early times, but even with 5G, I think some of these might be possible.
Agreed. Okay, there's another question pop up. In your robotics project, can the robotics identify non-metal objects or not?
Yes. Yeah. It can identify many of the things that we work with are non-metallic. Actually, most of them are non-metallic. So it can do that type of identification.
because you use vision, right? The computer vision cameras.
Because you use vision, or because you tag them with an RFID, or because you combine vision and tag with an RFID to know what else is there, even if you do not see it.
That's right. Okay, any question from the audience? Last minute call. So, all right. I think that's basically concludes today's seminar. And thanks again, Fadel, for very exciting and very nice presentation. Very interesting presentation. So I think, yeah, that's it for today, guys. And we're gonna see you in the next seminar. Thanks again. Again, the talk will be, the video will be uploaded onto the NSF Edge Institute website. Thank you all. Thanks, Fadel, for taking your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye for now.